Hi, it's Michelle. We're taking a short spring break and we'll be back next week with new episodes. This week, we'll listen back to a wonderful conversation I had last fall with the journalist Meg Kissinger. And it kind of gets to the heart of what we're trying to do with the show. It's about Meg looking into the truth about what really happened in her family of origin, separating the myths from the facts, and making sense of her own story. A quick note, this episode contains a discussion of suicide. Welcome to In This Family. In This Family is in-depth conversations with fascinating people about mental health, family, the past, and the future. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, the president and CEO of Nexus Family Healing, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and your host. In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization who helps youth and families heal from trauma and complex mental health challenges. We believe every child is worth it and every family matters. Meg Kissinger is a veteran journalist. Over the course of her career, Meg has done a lot of investigative reporting on problems in the mental health care system and has won several awards for her work. A big reason why she's so passionate about how people with mental illnesses are treated is that it was a big issue in her family growing up. Meg was one of 8 kids near Chicago in the 60s and 70s. Bipolar disorder, depression, substance use, and anxiety factored heavily in the lives of the kids, as well as Meg's mom and dad. 2 of Meg's siblings died by suicide. So please be aware that we do talk about that in this episode. There is also some discussion of violence. Meg Kissinger wrote about her life, about her work, and about mental health in her memoir, While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence. It was an editor's choice in both the New York Times and Los Angeles Times. The Atlantic listed it as a book that can change the way you think about mental illness. I wholeheartedly agree. I loved this book. I had a wonderful conversation with Meg about her family of origin and her own family, which includes kids and grandkids. We also talked about why she prefers the word discrimination over the word stigma. Meg, hello. It's great to have you here.
I am very happy to be with you.
Why don't we start by having you talk about your family?
So I am the 4th of 8 kids. We were born a long time ago. We grew up in Chicago, or a suburb of Chicago called Wilmette. Big old Irish Catholic family. And I was, the monkey in the middle. My family is adorable, lovable, fun, but also very banged up with mental illness. And that is something that we didn't know how to talk about. We didn't know what was in front of us. And as the years unfolded, some tragedy ensued. But through all that tragedy, there was indeed a great deal of affection and love and joy, which sounds weird when you are talking about a family that has, been as troubled as we were with these very serious mental illnesses.
Explain what mental illnesses manifested in your family and with who.
I think the biggie, or disease that we're most related to, is bipolar. And that is, my father had that diagnosis. Of course, we didn't learn that until way late in the game. My mother had depression and anxiety. And as I so snarkily observed one time, take 2 alcoholics, one with bipolar and the other with depression and anxiety, and let them have 8 kids in 12 years. And, what could possibly go wrong? So, as it turned out then, 3 of my siblings had very serious mental illness. My sister Nancy, who died in 1978, didn't really have that diagnosis of bipolar because they didn't call it bipolar in those days. To summarize, the prevailing illness in our family is bipolar. And it is with a smattering of depression and a big dollop of alcohol abuse. But again, sometimes these terms are kind of squishy. And as you know, best of all, mental illness is best described as a cluster of symptoms. So many of those symptoms that my family members experienced would be classified as bipolar. So wide mood swings, impulsive behavior, kind of chaotic living.
Meg, can we take some of your family members one by one a little bit and maybe describe what that bipolar and depression looked like for each one? And maybe let's start with your parents. So when you talked about your dad, what'd that look like with your dad?
So my dad was a larger than life character, so charming, could like the proverbial, like could sell water wings to the seals. He was just a very magnanimous, impressive guy. But the flip side of that was, again, like erratic behavior, very volatile, prone to lash out. And when, you have all those kids in such short order, there was lots of sharp elbows and slaps and punches, and then followed very quickly by tears and hugging and apologies. And so as a little kid, what that looked like was, very confusing behavior. So we knew that my dad was as warm as could be, funny as all get out, had a nickname for everybody and really funny stories. So, I could see him in all of his humanity. He just had just very extreme behaviors. My mother, by contrast, was a lot quieter and you would say more kind of thoughtful seeming, very intelligent, loved to read. She was brilliant, very caring, when she talked to you, you could kind of feel like the whole world fell away, like she was really focused on you, which is an amazing trait for a mother of 8 children. So that none of us really felt like we were left out of the big old pig pile. We all felt very attended to.
With your dad and the volatility, how frequently are we talking about?
Every day. You really did not know. And sometimes it would be from 1 minute to the next. Just to set the stage for what, the home climate was like. So if you can imagine, again, 8 kids in 12 years. So we're all bang, bang, bang. And we lived in a pretty big house. We were lucky to have, some means. My dad had a good job when we were young. That changed later in life. He had a checkered work history, which is pretty typical of people with bipolar. But anyway, so he was often away also. He was a salesman. So he was very often in New York City for much of the week, leaving my mother home alone with these 8 kids. So when we would see my dad was very often on weekends or, at night. And it was, again, there was a lot of commotion. There were kids doing homework. There were kids at basketball games. There was people filing in and out of the house. And then, as the years wore on and some of the kids developed serious mental illness, there were those distractions. So you never knew what you had with my dad. You didn't know, is this going to be the funny, cuddly, affectionate guy, or is this going to be the raging, scary, hitting person?
And would you have considered that abuse back in those days, like a physical abuse?
No, not at all. And he didn't seem really out of step and our family didn't seem really out of step with what was going on. So the neighborhood that I grew up in were almost all these very big Irish Catholic families, and we were just an enclave. So on our block, the Closies across the street had 10 kids. The Binders across the street had 6. our next door neighbors had a pile of kids. So this was the baby boom. It was the 60s and early 70s, and you couldn't swing a cat without hitting, a couple of your brothers and sisters. It just was a very lively, hectic environment.
And did he have those responses with all the kids or just certain ones more than others?
I would say all. There were some kids responded to it differently.
And say more about that.
Sure. So some knew how to get away. Okay, I'll use my sister Patty and me as an example. We're next to each other in line. So I'm number 4, she's number 5. Okay, so I'm kind of the moth to the flame. So I'm kind of the one like going right into the action. So when my dad would get feisty, I didn't back down. And sometimes that meant I would be on the business end of his fist or his elbow. But Patty knew how to skedaddle. So, when she could see that kind of wild look in his eye, or he's, being very demanding about cleaning out the garage on a Saturday morning, she would grab a broom and go to a corner. Whereas I would get right all up in it. So I don't think anybody was singled out. And I need to say, this is, my dad was just a loving man, but he just couldn't control his behavior. And so, I think there's a couple of ways that people can go about recalling their childhood. And you can either be kind of bitter about it and, hold a grudge or be stuck in that. Or you can appreciate the saddle that he had. I always gave him the benefit of the doubt, that he was acting out of love and best interest and doing the best that he could.
And how did it play out with your dad and your mom, given your dad's struggles?
Yeah, they were very in love. And, we've drawn a lot of comfort from that over the years. So my mom died when she was 66. She died of lymphoma. So, relatively young. But they were crazy for each other. He was chasing her around the house all the time to give her a smooch. And they were very, he was much more emotive, and he was way more, just very, very passionate. My mother was much more guarded. And she was mannerly, she had great manners, and she wasn't, I would say he was almost vulgar, and she was very refined. So that's kind of a funny combination, but she got a kick out of him. So they had a very affectionate relationship.
And how was she aware of the effect he was having on you guys?
Yeah, I think she looked the other way sometimes. And that, I will say, is, bothered me. And I can remember, when he'd go on a tirade, and I wished more often than not, that she would intervene. So I don't know how much she could have done. I don't know how, without her getting hurt in the process. I think she picked her spots. I mean, in certain ways, she stood up to him. She would say to him, like, "Back down, Bill," or she would do her best to advocate for us.
Well, and you mentioned your mom having depression and some anxiety. I have to think that played a role in how much she was going to engage too. What did you see from your mom and her depression?
Yes. So my mom grew up in a family that just didn't talk about stuff. An example of that is this. She was 18 years old. She was a freshman in college when her mom had a baby. Her mom had, my mom was one of just 4 kids. But anyway, so this child was born when my mom was a freshman in college. And that child had Down syndrome. And nobody talked about it. And my mother knew it. I mean, she took one look at her baby brother and could tell. But her parents just wouldn't discuss it. And so she grew up in a culture of silence and in a culture of not taking stuff on head on. So that's, I think, she brought that into our family culture as well. So I think, yeah, my dad's alcoholism and his erratic behavior, that's stuff that she just learned to kind of work around. But she carried in her just a real sense of melancholy. And as I said, she was quiet, and but she was also very, this sounds contradictory, but she was also one to be very involved, like in all the chores of like ladies of the baby boom. She would come and be like the playground supervisor or our Girl Scout leader, or she went to all of our basketball games. So she was very present to us, but also in some ways very detached, so she couldn't really get to us, which I thought was kind of a condition of her, drinking 2 martinis every night and taking sedatives, so that blunted her responses to us.
At what point did you realize that that something wasn't right, that she was experiencing things?
Yeah. Well, I remember, and I wrote about this in the book that I wrote, coming down the stairs one morning just before I started first grade, and my mother wasn't there, and I went looking for her and couldn't find her, and nobody would tell me where the heck she was. I now know, so many years later, I know that she was being hospitalized for depression, probably postpartum. She just had her 7th child. But nobody would talk, and the way that nobody would talk about it seemed odd to me. I thought if she had pneumonia or something, or whatever, a broken leg or something that I could understand in my 6-year-old brain, that would be, satisfying. But the fact that nobody would talk about it kind of raised my suspicions. So that's when I had my first kind of inkling that something was going on that I wasn't supposed to talk about.
And did you and your siblings ever talk about what was happening with your mom or your dad?
Not really. I mean, we would signal to one another, like, look out, dad is on a rampage, or we'd tease my mom about being so spacey. She was unflappable sometimes. We would, we were running around, and I can remember a famous story about her being in the grocery store. So she's got like 2 kids in a grocery cart, a bunch of food, and, that there too. And then my little brother Billy running around. And as she's talking to one of her friends, and these are the days that you could smoke a cigarette in the grocery store, she's in this deep conversation with this friend of hers, smoking the cigarette. The ash on the cigarette is like 3 inches long. And my brother Billy topples this whole, wall of tin cans. And my mother didn't even flinch. So, that was kind of how she was. She just kind of learned how to tune everything out. Or maybe as I said, maybe the martinis and the Valium did that for her.
Looking back, how did you make sense of how your parents have affected you?
I think it engendered a lot of empathy in me, and understanding that people can't always behave the way they want to or might want to, and that is hard for them, and it's hard for the people around them. And so when we assign shame or blame to things like depression or bipolar or anxiety, it's really misplaced, and that just creates even more trouble. So I think that's one of the lessons that I learned from that. They were also really compassionate people to others. So our house, if it weren't chaotic enough, was always a spot where neighbors and friends stopped by. I can never remember a Thanksgiving when there wasn't some rando people sitting at our dining room table, eating the turkey. Like, they just invited everybody all the time. So they were warm and welcoming that way. And, it's funny, as I'm talking about it right now, I'm thinking, I wonder if that was kind of a defense mechanism for them. They could surround themselves with other people so that they didn't have to kind of think about what's going on in the family of origin.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your siblings.
Sure. Yeah. So, the most noteworthy, there are three who, would be identified as having really life-altering mental illness. I hate even saying mental illness because it's just, it's an illness like any other. But anyway, so in the birth order, so there was my sister Mary Kay, then came Nancy, Jake, then me, then Patty, Billy, Danny, Molly. Anyway, of those kids, two died by suicide. So my sister Nancy, who was the second oldest, who ever since I can recall, she was 4 years older than I, she always struggled with erratic behavior. And it got her in trouble, in school as a little kid. It looked like naughty behavior. And then as she got older, it was more like drinking and drug abuse, when she got into college. And she just struggled ever so much more mightily as the years went on with her depression and thoughts of serious suicide attempts. And then ultimately she did die by suicide. She was 24 years old when she died.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that.
Thank you. Yeah, then I was going into my senior year of college. It was a shock, but not a surprise. But, she wasn't a threat to me anymore because she had been.
Talk about how Nancy was a threat to you.
Sure. So, occasionally she would have hallucinations or delusions. She was, by then, her bipolar was really out of control. And every once in a while, she would grab a knife. And sometimes I was on the business end of that. She would chase me around. I remember one time waking up and she was standing over me with a knife, which, is horrifying. But I don't know that she would ever have actually stabbed me or used it, but I sure as heck didn't want to wait around to find out. So anyway, she was the first. That was 1978. And then the next in line is my brother Jake. And Jake, who is now 70 years old, but Jake is kind of my good news Kissinger. He has had a life of depression, anxiety, kind of chaotic thought. He's really not able to kind of manage the affairs of daily living. He lives in a group home currently in the Chicago area. But like a nicer person you will never find. Huge heart, funny, smart, thoughtful, generous, just one of the best people I know. And so what distinguishes Jake is that Jake was always willing to acknowledge his illness and never apologize for it or feel ashamed of it. He doesn't want to have it, but he's very forthcoming and very accepting. He gets frustrated and sad that he has it, but he has taught me over the years, just to call it the way it is and ask for help when you need it, and no need to apologize for anything. So he's the next in line. And then there's me, and then there's my sister Patty. And Patty, all of us in our teenage years struggled with anxiety. How could you not when there's all this turmoil at home?
Right.
So to a person, everybody had fits of anxiety or not being able to really thoughtfully cope. And that manifested in different ways, either really angry, like classic lashing out teenagers, or some eating disorders. There were some people in the family had eating disorders. And then my brother Danny was the second youngest. He was classic bipolar. Danny was probably the most affected by my sister Nancy's suicide. So he was going into his sophomore year of high school. And on the night that Nancy died, my dad gathered us all into the living room, and he said, looking at each of us quite sternly, and said, if anybody asks, this was an accident. And he said that because he was really afraid that, A, my sister was not going to be afforded the dignity of a Catholic funeral or have her body be buried in the Catholic cemetery. And he was also embarrassed. I think he felt like people were going to judge him and my mom and, what kind of family has a kid who takes her own life. But what that did, those words, which were very chilling, it settled in us the notion that this is something to be very ashamed of. It's worth lying about. And Danny, I believe, was at such an impressionable age, and also, who's more self-conscious than a 14 or 15-year-old boy. Anyway, I think that the unsettled, that never having been dealt with in a straightforward way set this very bad pattern for him of shame. And so when his own symptoms of bipolar began to emerge, he was very scared to acknowledge that, very hostile to acknowledge that. So he never accepted treatment. Unlike Jake, the very willing patient, Danny would not at all abide any suggestion that he needed any help. And his illness just got, worse and worse, and he got in more trouble and just made a mess out of his life. And sadly, he too ended up, taking his own life. He was 34 when he died. And that was a gut punch, they both were, but we felt like we probably should have known more to help him in a better way.
Let's talk about your book while you were out. First of all, I loved it. Read it over a weekend. It was incredible. I had a really hard time putting it down. It really seemed to speak to me. Why did you want to write the book?
I want to say like a noble ambition to bear witness and to let people know that they're not alone. I just knew that, especially baby boomers, growing up in that time frame, just didn't have a way to talk about this. And I wanted to give a name to it all. I wanted to, as I said, bear witness and make people feel less alone. That certainly is true, that was a big motivation for me. But I will tell you honestly, what is also was a big motivation for me was anger. I was righteously angry, full of rage about our really, beyond imperfect, our very broken mental health system. And I was lucky enough, to have a job as a newspaper reporter, and I worked for a very good newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, fantastic regional newspaper in its day, in a time when local news was really thriving. And I was lucky enough to work for editors who really believed that one of the biggest scandals of our time is how people with mental illness are treated. So they let me go all over the place. I ran amok for years. I spent 25 years, really digging into the inadequacies of the mental health system. So I got to bring to that, I got to take all of my Kissinger family angst and rage and chaos and confusion and spin that to be a career in interrogating the principles and who is supposed to make our system work and why isn't it working, who's responsible for that. And I could bring, that anger to that very searing question is, why are we treating people with these illnesses in such a horrible way, and what do we need to do to make them better?
What do you see the difference back when you were growing up, relation to mental health, and now? Any difference?
Oh yeah, a ton of difference. So I do think that the discrimination persists. So we talk a lot about stigma with mental illness. I don't really like the word stigma, and I'm going to nerd out for a second just on my semantics here. But
Good.
yay. Okay, so stigma means, stigmata, which is the markings, the markings of Christ. That was where that word comes from. And so when we talk about stigma, we're talking about people marred or marked by their illness. And certainly we do treat people in this country who have, psychiatric illnesses as like the poor stepchildren of the medical community. But for my way of thinking as a journalist, what really moves the needle, or what really calls attention to what's going on, is when you couch it in the frame, or you put it in the framework of discrimination, because that's really what it is. It's people it's insurance companies not covering illnesses that need attention. It's employers that won't take a chance on somebody with depression or anxiety. It's landlords who won't rent to them. It's all the ways that we discriminate against people with mental illness. It's the way even comedians, speak about crazy people, and very disparagingly, and in ways that, that diminish their humanity. So yeah, I can get worked up in a very righteous head of steam. But so that persists. I think the discrimination against people with mental illness persists. What's gotten way better, of course, is that we're freer to talk about it, And I do believe that COVID was an equalizer, that people began to feel in those early lockdown days, they began to feel scared. They felt they were isolated. They felt lonely. They felt a lot of ways that people with serious mental illness feel. And so that engendered in them, much more empathy. We still greatly lack the precision in talking about what is mental illness. It's one thing to have like situational depression, or, you're having a bad hair day, whatever, versus schizophrenia, or, full-on hallucinations, or crippling depression where you can't get out of bed. So we still the general public lacks an understanding of what is mental illness, and then we certainly don't devote enough resources to figuring out how can we treat these people better, and what kind of medications we need to perfect, and it needs a whole lot more of attention.
When did you learn that your family was different from other families?
Well, I think after Danny died, you just take a little census and you're like, whew, that's 2 down to suicide in one family. That's a lot. Seems like a lot. So that's when I that's kind of the most glaring example. But again, like the other siblings, like they're kind of superstars in their own right. My sister Patty is a epidemiologist. She's the associate dean at Tulane University. My sister Mary Kay is a fantastic mural artist. My brother Billy is he's a very good musician and a newspaper or a TV news writer. My sister Molly is a superstar athlete. So everybody kind of found their own way to exercise their crazies and find, balance and success that way. And I think for me, again, it was like, I think journalism is what allowed me a way to be curious about the stuff that I was too afraid to delve into on my own. So I could ask a total stranger, tell me all about your hallucinations or your break with reality and your rampage that you just went on. Or I could interview families that had gone through some horrible crisis. And I could look at that in a more detached, clinical way and try to make sense of my own life with them as a surrogate. So that was very helpful to me. In some ways, I think my family is very unusual. I mean, in that the amount of heartache and sorrow. But also, I think we're also pretty typical of, if you scratch, deep enough, I think you'll find that most families have a big measure of what our family has.
So, what did you do differently as a mother with your own children, knowing and experiences what you have?
I overreacted. I mean, it's very understandable, but I was a total helicopter mom. Whereas we were like wolves. I remember this literally happened one time. I got grounded for something bad I did, and I was talking to my mom that night about. I was telling her that I didn't even know I was grounded. I went out to a movie, and I came home and I was telling her, "Oh, I just saw the greatest movie," and she's like, "You went to a movie? You're grounded." I was like, "I am." Anyway, so that's how they didn't know where the heck we were. So there's just no accounting, back in the day. Whereas when I was raising my kids, the polar opposite. If I didn't know, if they weren't home by 11 o'clock, I was calling the cops, or whatever. I was frantic. So I overreacted. I know that. And I ultimately did, on a very serious note, I did ultimately, finally, after trying to get by without ever seeing a therapist, which is a very stupid thing, really stupid, I finally availed myself of therapy at a much too late age. And it was so wonderful and so helpful. And I recently did EMDR therapy, and it was really great because I was having, kind of flashbacks, and I was overreacting to stuff. And EMDR, this eye movement
Desensitization and reprocessing.
It did help me. It helped me to, not freak out and not just go to this trigger reaction in my body to stress. So how it affected me as a mother was it made me much more vigilant. And that was good and bad.
Explain both. What was good about that and what was bad?
I mean, the good part is that I never took my kids for granted. I just, soaked up everything they did. And the bad is that I soaked up everything they did. I was not as inclined to let that tether go out any farther than I could, I wanted them ever close to me. I'm now a grandmother. I watch my 6-year-old granddaughter scramble up, and the 4-year-old scramble up these monkey bars, onto the play equipment. And I am like, everybody, every bone in my body is quaking. And I'm saying like, don't go any higher. And my daughter's like, Mom, it's fine. They know how to climb. And if they don't, then they're going to fall and they might break an arm, but they're going to be okay. It's not the way I raised my own children. So there is fallout. So I'm being kind of cheeky, but the serious answer is, it takes a toll. And I've had many conversations with my kids, to say, I'm sorry that I was, such a hovering mom, but I just didn't want to lose you.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. Very delightful conversation. Thank you for letting us into your world.
Michelle, thank you. It was really wonderful to talk to you.
Meg Kissinger's memoir is While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence. It's available wherever you get your books. In This Family is produced by John Moe, music provided by Jeremy Messersmith. You can learn more about Nexus by visiting nexusfamilyhealing.org. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you recommend In This Family to family and friends. Post about us on social and leave a rating or review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you next time.